see it around me all the time, and especially, I'm sorry to single them out. I don't mean any disrespect, but Hillary Clinton and her supporters, they have this naive cynicism about the rest of us that, oh, you've got to, only certain experience can get things done. Like if there's some magic bullet that they possess, that it's not left up to us, the people, to make the change that we want. It's left to a certain person that we put in power, and they and their hocus pocus are the only ones that can make the changes that we so desperately need. And, it struck me kind of funny because you fell into it, Brian. You said, well, even if Bernie Sanders doesn't get the nomination, not realizing that there are many states that are still up for grabs. And not only that, at the very last, he could employ another strategy, which is go independent. So, people have been writing his obituary way, way too early. And I think that in itself is the definition of what this smart lady is talking about, naive cynicism.
John, thank you very much. Of course, all I said is even if he doesn't get the nomination. But Rebecca, is there a comparison in your mind to be made between Bernie Sanders supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters in this respect?
I just think electoral politics, presidential electoral politics, are a horrific curse that visits us all every 4 years. And, and I see that on the part of a lot of people who aren't involved in politics on an ongoing basis, including Sanders as well as Clinton supporters. The idea we'll put this one amazing, wonderful person in the White House and then they'll fix everything, do everything for us. I think it's where we failed with Barack Obama. And those occasions when people push more strongly from the left than the right on issues like climate change and on anything, we have the power when one person is not going to fix things and change things on their own. And electoral politics really often just seems so afflicted by the belief that that's all we need and that's all we do. We put one person in office and then we all go home and sit on our hands and until it's time to complain about how they didn't fix everything.
How do you see Trump supporters in that light? Generally, or hugely, a whole different swath of Americans than who climbed back to some kind of hope with Barack Obama that they didn't have before.
I know that people support Trump as they do some of the other candidates for a lot of different reasons. Some people like that he's an outsider. Some people who support him seem to be in the Ku Klux Klan and like his dog whistle and overt racism, etc. And it is interesting that we have two leading candidates who are both outsiders to the parties and, the mainstream in some ways. So I think there's a lot of different things there, although there is this magic thinking that this man with no political experience and very little political knowledge is going to, also be a magic fixer.
William in East Orange, you're on WNYC. In defense of cynicism, William?
Well, not in defense of cynicism. I just think a reading of the power and the tactics of U.S. elite rulers, where, like, Dr. King gets too powerful, he gets murdered. And the Black Panther Party and infiltration and listening to people's phone calls. I think that some folks just get frustrated, have tried, and it's not, I don't think it's naive. 7% of the private sector is unionized. A lot because of government corporate attacks. While I do struggle with organization, I just don't want to write certain people off, although we seem to mention a lot of professional people, not working people without unions and so forth. So that's just a comment.
Rebecca?
Yeah, well, I think that there are tremendous powers rallied against us, and I totally acknowledge at times we lose, but I also think it's important to acknowledge times we don't lose when we organize and when we try, and that there are a lot of victories, and the landscape's more complicated than people think. I hear a lot of people say we can't do anything until we get money out of politics, but it's been really interesting seeing that, like, all the money of the oil industry couldn't get Mitt Romney elected, that Jeb Bush was the candidate with a $100 million war chest in the primaries, and he couldn't get any traction. All the money in the world couldn't buy him, even a chance at the nomination. It's a complex situation, and one of the habits of naive cynicism is to sort of have these one-size-fit-all dismissive prescriptions, like, oh, it's money in politics, oh, they have too much power, oh, this thing that hasn't happened yet will be like this thing we already know. No, and as I said in the beginning of the piece, the hardest thing for people, often in the media and in movements, to say is we don't actually know what's going to happen.
And we don't actually know what's going to happen. That piece, that's the only indisputable piece of punditry, I think, exists in the world.
You'll never hear from pundits.
That's right. We will leave, no matter how many times they're wrong. We will leave it there with Rebecca Solnit, whose article in Harper's is the Habits of Highly Cynical People. She writes the Easy Chair column in Harper's and is the author of 17 books. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Coming up, F.H. Buckley on why not to call Donald Trump a fascist. Stay with us.
WNYC salutes the arts. Join us in supporting local organizations, including House of Speakeasy, bringing writers and audiences together at Seriously Entertaining, a literary cabaret at Joe's Pub at the Public Theater, and Empire City Men's Chorus, dedicated to performing an adventurous repertoire and continuing collaboration with living composers on new works. For more information about the Support the Arts program, visit wnyc.org/star. WNYC receives support from Hospital for Special Surgery, where the world comes to get back in the game. More than 1,200 patient-submitted stories are at hss.edu/stories. The Poetry Society of America, joined by Garrison Keillor and Lori David to honor poet Billy Collins at their spring benefit at the New York Botanical Garden on Tuesday, May 24th. Tickets at poetrysociety.org.
New York City is facing a housing crisis, and not for the first time. In the 1930s, Mayor LaGuardia put forth a radical solution. He created public housing.
It becomes necessary for the government to step in so that people may live in decent homes.
There Goes the Neighborhood, a new series from WNYC and The Nation about gentrification in Brooklyn. Tune in tomorrow during Morning Edition and All Things Considered, or listen to the entire series at wnyc.org/neighborhood.
Brian Lehrer Show 30 Issues in 30 Weeks series continues this week as we take on paid family leave. That's 30 Issues in 30 Weeks, the most comprehensive election issues guide you'll find anywhere in broadcasting. Here are the segments. Sign up for the newsletter that will start sending out a week from today. 30 issues on the Brian Lehrer Show this week, beginning tomorrow. Paid family leave.
On the Republican side, things are a little more, how shall we say this, a little more loose. Just look at the confusion over the invitations to tonight's dinner. Guests were asked to check whether they wanted steak or fish, but instead, a whole bunch of you wrote in Paul Ryan.
President Obama, from his comedy sketch at the White House Correspondents' Dinner Saturday night with a ring of truth. And yet, as the primary season goes on, more and more Republicans seem to be willing to make a choice that's on the menu: Donald Trump. Earlier in the program today, we heard the case against this normalization of Donald Trump from a liberal perspective, and there are still some conservatives, not named Ted Cruz, who continue to resist, like Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina.
And I think Hillary Clinton is an incredibly flawed candidate, but she will mop the floor with Donald Trump, because with women and Hispanics, they hate Donald Trump because he's so harsh and he's so cruel in his policies toward illegal immigration, and he's so insulting toward women in general. The Republican Party, if we embrace Donald Trump, you're rejecting conservatism for Trumpism, which is a cult of a strong man that absolutely is nowhere near conservatism.
Cult of a strong man that is nowhere near conservatism. Lindsey Graham on CBS Face the Nation yesterday. Well, let's talk next to a conservative who has written recent articles called Explaining Trump and Understanding Trump, and a book review called The Case for Trump. Among his arguments, it's wrong to call Trump a fascist, as Lindsey Graham insinuated there. George Mason University law professor and American Spectator columnist F.H. Buckley also has a new book of his own, which we'll talk about, called The Way Back, Restoring the Promise of America. Professor Buckley, thanks for coming on. Welcome to WNYC.
Ryan, thanks very much for having me.
And since people must be wondering, are you related to William F. Buckley and that Buckley clan?
Well, I guess so, but only in a sense I'm related to you, like
we're all
third deep cousin or whatever.
Yeah, okay. And I see you're Canadian by birth. And
yep.
I noticed that in the book you call for the U.S. to adopt the Canadian model on a few things, like corporate taxes and capital gains taxes and our immigration laws. I think most Americans would assume that Canada is more liberal on things like those than the United States is. It's not the case?
I don't think it's the case. It's sort of like a palimpsest, which is what happens when you scrape a manuscript and there's something underneath it. So what you've got in Canada, for example, is a lot of liberalism, but underneath that is a deep conservatism, and it's just vice versa in the United States. I mean, there is a lot of ostensibly, conservative free market principles, but underneath that there's a core of radicalism, and each country makes its own compromises with that.
So Canadian immigration law is what?
Canadian immigration law is complicated. Let's start with Syrian refugees. Canada had a program to bring in 50,000. I think it's great. I mean, it's really moving. You saw the Prime Minister welcome these people. I mean, I thought it was wonderful. Meanwhile, in the United States, I think there's something like 5,000 being brought in. If you wanted to match Canada, it'd be 500,000. And what is worse is the problem in question was caused by crazy foreign policies of the United States under both recent presidents, and it's like the toy in a china shop who broke something and then walked away with it. On the other hand, other parts of the Canadian immigration policy are things that Trump would love. I mean, when you have illegals in Canada, you know what they do? Well, they give them a refugee hearing, but then they put them on the plane. You have a country that's 20% foreign born as compared to about 14, 15 here, and it's not an issue, and the reason is there's this deep conservatism with an overlay of liberalism where it matters.
And maybe the biggest thing in terms of not having the kind of backlash against the immigrants who are here, if I'm reading your book right, is that Canada doesn't have an immigration system that's based so much on family unification, letting your relatives come in, as it is on taking people in who have the skills that the country needs?
Something like that. Back in the day, family reunification made a lot of sense because, for people whose ancestors left the old country, it was a long goodbye. But nowadays there's something called Skype, and there are cell phones, and there are cheap airline tickets, and it's not such a big deal to go back and forth. I mean, my mother was up in Toronto, and I went up 5-6 times a year to see her. Not a big deal.
And capital gains taxes, do they have a lower capital gains rate than income tax rate up there?
Yeah, the income tax rate is roughly equal in Ontario to New York. In fact, it's a little less in Ontario. And I guess when Canada's a tax haven, you got problems. So capital gains a lot less, corporate taxes a lot less. But also, here's the kicker, none of those crazy earmarks, loopholes that so disfigure the U.S. tax system. I mean, the tax code is just a lot smaller in Canada. You just don't have the interest cloud.
And you also compare income and mobility in the two countries, and you find Canadians born to the poorest parents are more likely than those in this country to grow up and have higher incomes as adults. And you credit differences in public education, immigration, and the rule of law for part of this. What's the public education piece of that?
Well, just before we start, the differences in terms of can you get ahead, absolutely huge. I mean, I looked at the figures, I was absolutely shocked. It was just amazing. You know, the idea of America, the American dream is this is the place where everybody can get ahead. And it's not like that, right? It's, somebody said it's the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe in it. The mobile countries are countries like Denmark and Canada, and America is kind of aristocratic by comparison. It's a country of fixed classes. It's got a new class, and if you had to design American policies, right, and you wanted to produce an aristocracy, you'd end up pretty close to what we have. Education, look, I grew up in a little French-Canadian town with like 99% French-Canadian. I went to a public school. The teachers were nuns. I told a friend of mine this. He was a judge, a federal judge, African-American. He said, yeah, taught by nuns. Didn't anybody object? And I said, yeah, there was this group. You know, its motto was one country, one language, one school system. I was a Ku Klux Klan, you know, and his mouth dropped. So here's the thing. When you have an established religion like they do in England or quasi-established as in Canada, you end up somehow with more religious liberty because the establishment part counts for nothing, but what you get is state support for parochial schools, religious schools. So when I left Canada, I left Montreal in '89. I mean, you know, my daughter could have gone to an English Catholic school, an English Protestant school, a French Catholic school, a French Protestant school, a Jewish school, or basically nada. That meant competition, and competition is what it's about.
So I don't want to get bogged down in the eternal vouchers debate, but you advocate that as a core policy for income mobility in your book, and many people would argue that the market works well for many things, but not for public education, which even with vouchers paying part of the cost, will sort and seek out the more affluent to give better educations to, and increase inequality and immobility, as opposed to public models like Japan and Germany, if we want to look to different countries, that successfully educate a larger percentage of kids. But, you know, I don't want to use up all our time on this, but that is the argument on the other side.
Yeah, although you do have in Germany, for example, you have state-supported confessional schools. There's no Bismarck, there's no culture camp, and you know, when you have competition, it's not like you see the gears working, but what you see is parents choosing. And in DC, for example, right now, you've got a very, very vibrant charter school system, and in the public schools, the principals go around door to door trying to persuade people to go to public schools. Everybody's trying to get better. And you don't see it working, but it just does work.
By the way, you said Denmark, and you're here as kind of an identified conservative author and columnist, and you've said a number of conservative things, but when you talk about Denmark, then the Bernie Sanders supporters' ears pop up and say, wait, Denmark, with all its socialism, has the most, among the most, you know, income mobility, generation to generation. So what is it about Denmark?
Well, like, you're asking me, I know something about Denmark, except, you know, they're sort of getting, I know, but they're getting it right. Let me tell you something. You mentioned Bernie Sanders. Like, Canadians don't have a clue what their country's about. Same's true of Americans. You tend to see things on this right-left spectrum, and it's not like that anymore. It's more like 1776. That wasn't right-left. That was Republican virtue on the one side and corruption on the other. I completely understand Bernie Sanders supporters, and there's something I think of that in Trump as well. At least there may be a pious hope that a guy who's played the system knows how to cure it. It's sort of a Joe Kennedy thing.
My guest is George Mason University law professor F.H. Buckley. His new book is The Way Back, Restoring the Promise of America. He's also an American Spectator columnist and blogger, and he's been writing about Donald Trump. So let's get to Trump. We heard the clip of Lindsey Graham saying Trump represents the cult of a strong man, which is nowhere near conservatism. You've pushed back, not against that statement, which just came yesterday, but in general against that sentiment in a recent blog post against conservatives who called Donald Trump fascist. Was Graham's cult of a strong man in that category for you?
Oh, number one, I think most politicians are, gee, I have to be polite here, but I think there's something wrong in placing too much faith in one person to save you. It's not going to be any one of these guys. And as for Trump, I think at this point it's mostly a question of aspirations rather than understanding. There are people who are reading things into him that they'd like to see, and I think what they'd like to see is an end to corruption and a change, not so much making America great. I don't, that doesn't resonate with me. Making Americans better off, making the country more mobile, curing a problem of aristocracy, that's what my book was about. So I don't, you know, the strong man, you know what? I see him as a New Yorker, okay? I always love New Yorkers, all right? You know, he's like Chuck Schumer.
You and Ted Cruz see him as
yeah,
a New Yorker.
Don't get me started on him.
But seriously, the fascist label comes from a number of things, including his cultivating vigilant supporters who he encourages to punch protesters in the face, even peaceful ones, if they even look like they might cause trouble. That's one of the things that makes him so unprecedented as a major party presidential potential candidate. Another is his statement that he would order our troops to commit torture, and if they refuse for constitutional reasons, never mind, he'll make them obey. And he's expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin's style and strength. Do these things not have some whiffs of a cult of the strong man, as Senator Graham put it, or what some would call whiffs of fascism?
Whiff of fascism. Do we get to that, the F word, so quickly? There are things he said which disturb me. Let me tell you about waterboarding. We hanged Japanese admirals for waterboarding our people in World War II. Waterboarding is torture. Full stop. That's it. So you know something? When a candidate says things which are egregiously wrong, you hope that he's going to modify his positions. That's the best I can say.
Lindsey Graham wasn't done with Trump on Face the Nation yesterday. In the clip we played, he went on to say this about Trump's total Muslim entry ban as a way of fighting ISIS.
I choose to fight them with partners. Don't say that we should ban all Muslims to come to America, because it'd be hard to get Muslims to fight with you in the Mideast where ISIL exists. Don't declare war on the religion, declare war on radical Islam. To my Republican colleagues, distance yourself as much as you can from Donald Trump, because he's toxic for conservatism.
And that's another reason that many liberals and some conservatives feel we can't become complacent enough about Trump to allow him to be normalized by polite conversation, that he has to be seen as an unprecedented threat to our country. Where are you on the Donald Trump versus Lindsey Graham spectrum on that?
Well, I agreed with the first sentence that Graham uttered, but not the second. I think that it is the case that you can't have a blanket ban on all Muslims. I don't see that as feasible, reasonable, workable, desirable, any of those things. On normalizing Trump, why don't we wait and see? I mean, he's produced one foreign policy speech. It got good reviews from a lot of people. There are a couple of other speeches he has yet to give. Let's see how those turn out. But I don't find him frightening. I don't find him anything other than a certain kind of typical American thus far. There was an author in Canada who wrote a book called Sam Slick, the Clockmaker. And Sam Slick was a traveling salesman who could sell you moonbeams. And there's sort of an American type. And I find it attractive. I'm waiting for more policy, though.
You've actually written that unlike Cruz and many other conservatives, Trump represents action, represents passion, and represents compassion. So to the bewildered liberal hearing that, make the case that Trump equals compassion in any way.
That was something said to me by a reporter. I must say it blew me away. Right? And here's my response. Trump is faulted for not being faithful to conservative principles. People like Cruz go out of their way to say, I'm completely faithful to conservative principles. Romney did the same thing. Romney had a 59-point plan. I don't remember one of those points. I'm tired of people that claim that they're faithful to principle but are indifferent to people. Romney in 2012 came across as a guy who wanted to give you the pink slip. Right? Cruz is pretty much in the same boat. what many people see as a want of compassion with respect to non-Americans, many people see as compassion to Americans, and they miss that.
To some Americans, but I think that's just where, in Lindsey Graham's view, he would become so destructively divisive. His compassion is mostly for a group of resentful white Americans who feel like their problems today stem from political correctness, too much advantage for Mexicans and Muslims, etc., compared to them. The real fascists like Hitler and Mussolini had that compassion for their selected group in spades, didn't they?
Gosh, we got to fascism 5 minutes ago. Now we're in the Hitler territory. Whenever you get to the Hitler territory, you've lost an argument, by the way. He's not like that, or he's not close to that. And it seems to me that it's wrong to say that you can talk about problems of mobility generally without being called a racist or a bigot. Ordinary Americans, and I'm not discriminating on the basis of race or anything, are economically in a rough place. Things have not gotten better for a long time. For the first time ever, people don't think their kids will do as well as they will. That's absolutely huge. That's really what one wants to fix. Like I say, for me, it's not making America great again. It's making Americans better off and really more mobile. I'd like this to be the country of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln's vision was we can all get ahead. And Lincoln was the epitome of that. So I'd like to see a Lincolnian kind of republicanism, which is compassionate with respect to these people. People, when you call these people bigots, you've just made 1,000 new Trump supporters.
Doesn't mean he's not a bigot. Before you go, we booked you weeks ago to talk about your book and about the news today, but in the last few days, I see there are these stories about the department in which you teach, the George Mason University Law School, that they want to rename after Antonin Scalia as a condition in the articles that I've read of a multi-million-dollar grant from the Koch brothers Charles Koch Foundation. The overall university faculty is considering a resolution opposing the renaming. I'm just curious, as a member of the faculty and maybe as a professional conservative writer, if that comes into it, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, my opinion is $30 million is good, right? As for the name, I'm not too interested. You know something? I'm really a great fan of the framers. I really like George Mason. I would have kept the name, right? Nobody knows who George Mason was, but he was his absolute.
The law school had the same name as the university.
That's correct.
George Mason.
Yeah.
And you would have kept the name. Do you think it's just liberal opposition to naming something after Antonin Scalia that's informing your colleagues, or is there more something about being able to buy the naming rights in honor of your favorite, ideological compatriot?
Well, first of all, naming rights are for sale all over the place, right? And it's just a question of, what the price is. As for the opposition, it's coming from, not the law school, nobody at the law school, but it's coming from places like cultural studies and people who are leaders in the BDS, Boycott, Divestment group. So that's where it's coming from.
So you think the law school faculty generally
totally is
100%?
Oh, we like the money.
And there we leave it with F.H. Buckley, professor at the George Mason University School of Law, perhaps soon to be called the Antonin Scalia School of Law, and author now of The Way Back, Restoring the Promise of America. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Coming up next, did you know that New York is number 2 only to Silicon Valley in the local tech economy? Well, there's a new organization being launched in New York today that's going to try to bring us closer to number 1, and we will talk to the executive director of that group and how she hopes to do it. Stay with us.
Before she was on Orange is the New Black, Diane Guerrero maxed out her credit cards.
I try to fix it, but how my mother says, tapar el sol con un dedo. Try to cover the sun with a finger.
Diane's been on her own in the U.S. since she was 14, when her parents were suddenly deported.
I walk in and there's my mother's dinner started, but she wasn't there. I just dropped to my knees.
I'm Anna Sale. Listen at deathsexmoney.org.
WNYC is supported by GEICO, offering auto insurance coverage for cars, trucks, or SUVs and providing 24/7 customer service. More information on auto insurance at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO. CUNY TV, presenting Science Goes to the Movies, made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. This week, discussing the science of comedy and film with Louis Black, voice of Anger in Inside Out. Schedule and channel information at cuny.tv.
WNYC is interested in your feedback. Help us understand what you want to hear and your listening preferences by taking our brief survey at wnyc.org/research. That's wnyc.org/research.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and New York's technology industry is second only to Silicon Valley's. We are a clear number 2, way ahead of Boston, unlike the Yankees this weekend. According to a story in the New York Times, job growth in the industry has increased by 60% in the last 6 years, and startups in the city pulled in almost $2 billion in venture capital funding in the first 3 months of this year alone, the most for any quarter in 5 years, and by this measure too, second only to Silicon Valley. But it's a distant second. My next guest hopes to narrow that gap as the executive director of Tech NYC, the newly formed official advocacy group of New York City's tech sector, being officially unveiled today. She is Julie Samuels, the former head of Engine, a leading national advocacy organization supporting entrepreneurship and technology policy, primarily at the federal level.